The Veth arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. Tuesdays are the most efficient day of the week. No one is still shaking off Monday. No one is already half checked out for the weekend. Just clean, undramatic productivity in the middle of the week. They would have appreciated that, I think, if any of them had ever understood what a Tuesday was. There were 9 of them. That was the first thing I noticed, because we'd been told to expect a delegation, and delegation had implied something smaller. 9 felt more like an occupation, though they didn't carry themselves like occupiers. They carried themselves like accountants, quiet, methodical, armed with those flat tablets of light they used for everything, already recording before they'd cleared the airlock. I was standing 2 meters back from the docking collar when they came through, which put me behind Lieutenant Commander Ose, and slightly to the left of Chief Warrant Officer Haddon, which was more or less where I preferred to be for events I hadn't asked to attend. I was Ensign Dahl. I ran the Ops Coordination Desk on the Keswick's secondary bridge. I had been in the fleet for 2 years and 3 months, which was long enough to know that when command schedules a joint operations efficiency review and assigns your vessel as the host platform, the word review is doing a great deal of work. The Keswick was a liaison vessel. That was its official designation and its actual function, which doesn't always overlap as neatly as you'd hope. Liaison vessels exist to operate in the gap between human fleet protocols and whatever the partner species needs them to be, which in practice means the crew becomes very comfortable with ambiguity and very good at improvising solutions to problems that aren't technically their jurisdiction. We were a crew of 22. We had 1 dedicated science officer, 1 dedicated communications officer, 2 engineers who were effectively interchangeable with the maintenance techs, and the rest of us were generalists who'd learned to read each situation as it arrived rather than waiting for the manual to catch up. That last part is important. I didn't understand how important until later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Assessor Seth was the first one through the collar. I knew he was the head of the delegation because he walked at the front, and because the others oriented themselves around him the way smaller objects orient around something with more mass. Not deferential, exactly. More like calibrated. They were all calibrated to him. The Veth are smooth-skinned humanoids, which is a description that technically covers several dozen species and tells you almost nothing useful about any of them. In the Veth's case, what it means concretely is this: they are roughly human in silhouette, slightly taller with a skin tone that sits somewhere between pale gray and the color of old iron, and their faces have the quality of being in a state of permanent mild analysis. Not cold, not unfriendly, just busy. Their expressions are the expressions of someone running a calculation you can't see, and the closest they get to warmth is when the calculation resolves in a way that confirms their prior model. Assessor Seth resolved his calculation and addressed Commander Osai with a nod and a phrase in Veth formal register, which our ship's translator rendered as, "We are prepared to begin the assessment." Osai said, "Welcome aboard." Seth had already turned to look at the corridor. That was the first log entry I found out later. Veth assessors carry continuous recording equipment as standard. It's not hidden. It's not covert, it's just on, the way breathing is on. The time stamp on entry 1 was approximately 11 seconds after Seth cleared the airlock, and it read, "Host crew uses non-operational greeting as primary response to stated operational readiness. Duration of non-operational exchange, 4.3 seconds. Logged." 4.3 seconds. That was the first deviation. There were, over the next 18 days, 407 more. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for understanding what happened later. The Veth were not malicious. I've worked alongside species that were actively contemptuous of humans. They wear it differently. There's an edge to contempt, a heat, a particular quality of attention that tells you the person looking at you has already decided you're less than they expected. The Veth had no edge and no heat. What they had was a framework in which efficiency was the primary metric of competence, and within that framework, they were genuinely trying to help. The help felt like an audit. They spread themselves across the Keswick over the first 2 days in a way that managed to be both orderly and total. Seth took the primary bridge. 2 assessors took the engineering deck. 2 went to the mess hall and the crew quarters corridor, which surprised me until one of them explained, very politely, that crew rest patterns and nutritional intake were significant variables in operational efficiency modeling, and therefore relevant to the assessment. The remaining 4 rotated between ops, communications, and the secondary bridge, where I spent most of my working hours. Their secondary bridge lead was an assessor named Veth. Veth was younger than Seth, I thought, though it was difficult to be certain with Veth. Their age markers are internal and don't read cleanly to human eyes. What read clearly was that Veth took the work seriously in the specific way that young people take work seriously when they want to prove something. Every entry on that tablet was precise and prompt. Every deviation was logged with the exact timestamp and a brief notation about what the optimal behavior would have been. Veth informed me on the first morning that I could request a copy of the secondary bridge log at any time. I said that was fine. I didn't request it then. I didn't need to. I had a fairly clear picture of what was going in it by watching Veth's hands on the tablet. 7:31. Ensign Dahl initiates ops coordination cycle 7 minutes ahead of scheduled watch handover. Reason: non-standard, deviation logged. That one at least was accurate. I started early because Ensign Ewan's handover notes from the overnight watch tended to be thorough, and I liked to have time to read them before Ewan left. Ewan and I had worked out this rhythm over about 6 months, quietly, without any particular discussion. It saved about 12 minutes of back and forth at watch change. I didn't explain that to Veth. There was no good place to start the explanation that wouldn't have led somewhere longer than 12 minutes. 8:09. Ensign Dahl spends 47 seconds examining navigational plot 7C, no action generated. Non-productive engagement with static display. Deviation logged. That one I know for certain because Veth told me about it directly, which I found slightly remarkable, not the logging, but the transparency. Veth came over to the ops desk while I was still looking at the plot and said, "I've noted a non-productive engagement interval. Is there a task associated with this display?" I said I was thinking. Veth noted that in the log as well. Thinking, unspecified cognitive processing, no operational output generated, duration 47 seconds, deviation logged. What Veth didn't note, or what Veth noted without understanding the significance, was what I was thinking about. The navigational plot I'd been looking at covered the outer edge of the Keswick debris field, which lay approximately 6 days ahead of us on our survey route. The Keswick field was our primary mission objective. It was a post-collision debris zone roughly the size of a small moon's orbital path, dense with material from a planetoid fragmentation event that the science teams estimated had occurred somewhere between 800 and 1200 years ago. Standard deep survey work. Transit the field perimeter, take readings, log the density gradients, flag anything with resource or navigation interest, file the report. Straightforward on paper. Less straightforward in practice because the Keswick field had been surveyed once before by a Veth science vessel, and the data from that survey was now 12 years old. 12 years in a debris field is not a long time in geological terms. It is a reasonably long time in terms of whether your density model still reflects the actual distribution of large mass objects. I had been looking at the old survey data and thinking about that gap. Specifically, I'd been looking at the intermediate density zone, the second band of the field, between the sparse outer ring and the denser inner core, and thinking about how a debris field with a drift pattern like Keswick's would redistribute mass over 12 years. Not dramatically, probably not dramatically. But the model had been built on a point-in-time snapshot, and I was in the habit of thinking about what changes in the interval between a snapshot and now. It was the kind of thinking that doesn't produce a memo. It doesn't generate an action item. It just sits at the back of your head and updates quietly as new information arrives, and sometimes it's useful and sometimes it isn't, and you don't know which until the information arrives. Veth logged it as 47 seconds of non-productive engagement with a static display. I let it go. There was no efficient way to explain what I was doing that wouldn't take longer than the 47 seconds had. The mess hall logs became something of a running commentary for the crew. Word spread quickly. This is a 22-person ship. Word always spreads quickly that the Veth assessors assigned to the mess and quarters corridor were logging meal duration, meal composition, and what they politely called non-essential social interaction time. This is what the Veth called the conversations we had over food, non-essential social interaction, as distinct from essential social interaction, which was apparently any communication that directly preceded or followed an operational task. The implied distinction was that there was a category of communication that had operational value and a category that didn't, and that the second category was waste, and that a crew operating at theoretical optimum would minimize or eliminate the second category and fill that time with something measurable. Chief Petty Officer Marchetti, who had been in the fleet for longer than I had been alive and who took a philosophical view of most things, responded to this by continuing to eat his meals at exactly the pace he had always eaten them, and to have exactly the same quality of non-essential social interaction he had always had, and to say nothing about it whatsoever. This was not strategic. It was just how Marchetti operated. He had the equanimity of a man who had seen a sufficient number of things that one more thing logging his lunch wasn't going to disturb his equilibrium. Ensign Farrow, who was younger and more reactive, tried for 2 days to eat efficiently, shorter meals, less talking, and looked measurably unhappy while doing it. On the third day, Osai stopped in the mess at lunch, picked up a tray, sat down across from Farrow, and without saying anything about it specifically, had a conversation that took 24 minutes and covered 3 different subjects, none of which were the Veth assessment. By the end of it, Farrow was eating at a normal pace and talking at a normal rate. Osai finished his lunch and went back to the bridge. The assessor on mess duty logged Osai's lunch at 24 minutes. Non-essential social interaction, extensive, deviation logged. I ate my meals the way I always ate them. I had whatever was on the rotation. I talked to whoever was sitting near me. And I did not think about the tablet across the mess from me recording the minutes I spent on activities that had no direct operational purpose. I did once catch the eye of the assessor on mess duty, a Veth named S7, who was logging something while Marchetti was in the middle of a story about a previous posting. And S7 looked back at me with that expression of permanent mild analysis, and I held the look for a moment, and then I went back to my food. S7 logged the eye contact, duration 2.1 seconds, classification non-operational interpersonal engagement. I had been thinking, but there was no field for that in the log. The engineering deck was where I got a clearer picture of how the Veth processed what they were seeing. I went down on day 5 to coordinate a power routing adjustment with Dvorak, one of our engineers, and found both Veth assessors assigned to engineering standing near the main workbench, while Dvorak and Prinz worked through a calibration check on the secondary maneuvering array. The check was routine. It was in the maintenance schedule. It was, by the book, a single operator task. Dvorak and Prinz did it together. They'd done it together since they came aboard the Keswick. Their rhythm was entirely their own. Dvorak would run the calibration sequence while Prinz watched the output readings and called any deviation above 0.1% before the system flagged it, which usually meant Prinz was calling it 2 to 4 seconds ahead of the automatic alert. Then they'd switch on the next sequence. The whole thing took about 40 minutes and generated a calibration record that was, consistently, cleaner than the maintenance manual required. The Veth assessor, The one I'd started thinking of as the senior of the two, though I wasn't sure of the actual rank distinction, was logging the procedure in real time. "This is a single-operator procedure," he said to me, not accusingly, just nodding it. "Why are two technicians assigned?" I said they prefer it that way. "The procedure does not require two operators." "It goes better with two," I said. He noted something. "The additional operator represents approximately 40 minutes of misallocated crew time per calibration cycle." I thought about explaining that the calibration records generated by Dvorak and Prince together were consistently tighter than what the procedure required, and that tight calibration on the secondary maneuvering array was relevant when you were threading a ship through a debris field, and that the 40 minutes wasn't waste so much as it was insurance paid in advance. I thought about explaining that the two of them had worked out their rhythm so thoroughly that they caught things the automatic monitoring didn't flag, and that you couldn't get that by running the procedure once solo and calling it done. I looked at Dvorak and Prinz doing their thing, which was utterly self-contained and didn't need anyone to defend it. "Yes," I said, "they do it together anyway." The assessor logged it. I went and found Dvorak for the power routing question, and then went back to secondary ops. What I didn't say, and what wasn't in the log, was that Dvorak had spent 3 months on a vessel that lost its secondary maneuvering array during a hard debris transit, about 6 years before coming aboard the Keswick. The ship hadn't been lost. The mission hadn't been lost. But it had been a very bad 3 days, and Dvorak had never talked about it directly, but had developed a habit, afterward, of treating secondary maneuvering calibration as a thing worth taking seriously enough to do twice. And Prinz, who'd served with Dvorak before the Keswick, had developed the same habit by proximity and trust, the way good crews develop the habits of the people they serve alongside. That wasn't in the manual. It wasn't in the efficiency log. It was in the crew. And the crew was the ship more than anything the assessors were measuring. The rest cycles logged a similar kind of gap. The Veth's model for optimal crew rest was built on minimum effective duration, the shortest sleep period that preserved cognitive function to within a statistically acceptable margin of a fully rested baseline. Seth's team had the numbers for humans from Joint Operations Research, and the numbers were precise. 7 hours. That was the minimum effective duration for a human crew on a standard operational watch cycle. Our crew slept 7.5 hours. Some of them slept 8. Veth logged this as a daily deviation, 30 minutes to 60 minutes of excess rest time per crew member, which across 22 people across a mission cycle added up to what the log called significant accumulated non-operational time. I heard about the rest cycle logs from Ensign Ewan, who heard about them from Marchetti, who had apparently been present when Veth mentioned the deviation to someone in the quarters corridor, and had listened to the explanation with the air of a person hearing something mildly interesting for the first time. What Veth's log had no column for was what the extra 30 minutes did. Not to cognitive function. You couldn't measure that against a minimum effective baseline and see anything useful. What it did was harder to quantify. It was the difference between a crew that could sustain attention for an extended transit and a crew that was working at the edge of its reserve. It was the difference between Marchetti being sharp on the visual feed at hour 11 of a 14-hour transit and Marchetti being close enough to sharp to almost be the same thing. Almost is a very large gap when you're threading a ship through debris. The log said excess rest. The transit said Marchetti's eyes caught the city block mass 3 seconds before the sensors did. 30 minutes a night across 3 weeks logged as waste. On the 6th day, Assessor Seth requested a formal efficiency debrief with Commander Osai, which Os conducted in the small conference room off the primary bridge and which I attended as Osai's ops coordinator. Seth had brought Vel and one other assessor whose name I hadn't learned. They had a display prepared. The display showed the Keswick's operational efficiency rating, 61.3%. Seth presented this without commentary first, letting the number sit in the air for a moment the way you let a number sit when you are confident the number is doing your argument for you. Osei looked at it. Compared to what benchmark, he asked. Optimal operational efficiency for a vessel of this class and crew complement, Seth said. The theoretical maximum, given the resources available. And what does the theoretical maximum assume? Seth indicated a column on the display. Perfect task allocation, no redundant process execution, communication limited to operationally necessary exchanges, rest cycles calibrated to minimum effective duration rather than standard fleet allocation. Osei nodded slowly. He had the quality, which I had come to appreciate enormously in the 2 years I'd served under him, of giving ideas a fair hearing before responding to them. He sat with the display for a moment. "Walk me through the redundant process executions," he said. "What are you classifying there?" Vel pulled up a sub-display. "Cross-verification procedures," Vel said. "Your crew performs secondary confirmation on navigational calculations, power routing changes, and several categories of sensor readings at a rate significantly above what the error rate of the primary systems would statistically warrant." "Our systems have an error rate," Osei said. "A low one." "Low isn't zero. The probability of encountering an error that the redundant check would catch, given the current mission parameters, is 0.4%. Vel looked up from the tablet. "The time spent on redundant checks over a standard mission cycle would, reallocated, improve survey coverage by an estimated 8.2%. Os looked at the number. "What does your model use for current mission parameters?" Vel indicated the source data column. It was the Kasich Field Survey, the 12-year-old one. Os didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, I'll take this under advisement." The debrief ended there. Walking back to secondary ops afterward, I said to Osei quietly, because there were assessors in the corridor. They used the old Kasich data. "I know," he said. "Their efficiency model is built on 12-year-old density readings." "I know, Petra." I thought about saying more and decided the corridor wasn't the place. We walked the rest of the way in silence, and when we reached secondary ops, Osei sat down at the mission planning console and pulled up the Kasich survey and looked at it for a while, the way I'd been looking at it 3 days earlier. Vel logged that as well. "Commander Osei, 11 minutes 40 seconds of non-productive engagement with a static archival display. No operational output generated." The Veth's efficiency rating for the Keswick did not improve over the following week, which surprised them and didn't particularly surprise us. What happened was this. Os declined to implement the recommended process changes. He declined politely and completely, in writing, citing operational judgment informed by mission-specific factors under ongoing assessment. The Veth accepted this, because the assessment was explicitly advisory, and logged it as a deviation of the first order, the highest category, and continued their documentation with the steady, patient energy of people who believe the data will eventually speak for itself. The data continued to speak. It said that Marchetti spent an average of 22 minutes per meal. It said that Ensign Ewan spent 4 minutes every morning reviewing sensor logs that hadn't changed overnight. It said that Davorak and Prinz always did their equipment checks in pairs, even for tasks rated as single operator by the maintenance manual. It said that Lieutenant Nakamura, our communications officer, spent 8 to 12 minutes every shift composing outgoing messages in a style that included what the Veth logs classified as non-essential contextual preamble, which was Nakamura's habit of opening every intervessel communication with a brief, friendly line about conditions or context before getting to the operational content. Nakamura was asked about this directly by one of the assessors on day 9. I wasn't there for the conversation, but Nakamura told me about it afterward. In the kind of flat, descriptive way Nakamura told most stories. The assessor had asked why the preamble was necessary when the operational content of the message stood on its own. Nakamura had explained that calm relationships, like any relationships, were smoother when the parties felt they were talking to a person rather than a terminal, and that the context lines also sometimes contained information relevant to how the recipient should interpret the operational content, and that several intervessel misunderstandings over Nakamura's career had stemmed from messages that were technically complete but lacked enough context to be read correctly. The assessor had asked for examples. Nakamura had provided two. The assessor had logged the conversation, including Nakamura's examples, as an 11-minute deviation from optimal communication protocol. The examples themselves were in the log. They were, as Nakamura described them to me, good examples, the kind of thing that would make a reasonable person think twice about stripping the context out of a message. Whether the assessor found them compelling or simply documented them, I couldn't tell. What I could tell was that the Veth assessors were thorough. They logged everything, which meant they had a remarkably complete record of what the Keswick's crew did and how long it took. What the log didn't capture was why, and the why was, as it turned out, the only part that mattered. On the 9th day, Marchetti and Ensign Farrow had a conversation at lunch. I was sitting 2 seats down and caught most of it while eating and going through the morning ops summary on my tablet. Farrow was worried about the Keswick approach. Not in an alarmist way. Farrow was precise, methodical, didn't raise concerns without thinking them through, but there was something in the approach profile that was sitting wrong. Farrow couldn't quite place it, which was part of the problem. Marchetti didn't tell Farrow not to worry. He didn't explain the approach profile or offer reassurance. He asked what specifically felt off. He asked it the way he asked most things, which was without urgency and without any particular investment in a particular answer. Just, what are you actually seeing? Farrow talked. I listened with one ear and kept going through the ops summary. Farrow talked about the outer band entry vector, and about the transition point between the outer band and the intermediate zone, and about the density gradient at that transition, and about something in the old survey data that Farrow kept coming back to without being able to say exactly what was wrong with it. Marchetti asked what the data showed at the transition point. Farrow showed him on a tablet. Marchetti looked at it for a while. "It's smooth," Farrow said. "The gradient is very smooth. Too smooth, maybe, like it was modeled rather than measured." "You think the transition data is interpolated?" "I don't know, maybe. The survey report doesn't say." Marchetti handed the tablet back. "Worth asking," he said, and finished his lunch. That was the whole conversation. 22 minutes, mostly Farrow talking and Marchetti listening, and asking one question at a time until Farrow had talked themselves into something precise enough to do something about. The next morning, Farrow went to OSI with a specific concern about the density gradient data at the outer to intermediate transition point in the Keswick survey, and a specific question about whether the survey methodology had used interpolation at that boundary or direct measurement. OSI pulled the survey methodology notes. They were in the appendix, which nobody had read closely because appendices are where things go to be technically present, and found that yes, the boundary data was interpolated from measurements taken at the outer edge and at a point approximately 30 kilometers into the intermediate zone. The transition gradient itself was a modeled estimate, not a measured value. That was not in anyone's efficiency log. The conversation was logged, 22 minutes of non-essential social interaction, and the action it produced was logged. Commander Os spends 14 minutes reviewing survey methodology appendix. No operational output generated, but the connection between them was not in the log. The log had the form. The function was in the crew. The 8-degree entry vector adjustment OSI made 2 days later, which shifted our approach to the transition point so we'd hit it obliquely rather than straight on, which gave us a better sensor angle on the gradient as we entered it, which was directly relevant to what happened later. That was in the log as a 1.3% reduction in theoretical survey coverage on the eastern perimeter. A deviation. Logged. We reached the Cassock Field perimeter on day 14. The Veth had a transit model. Of course they had a transit model. They'd built it on the survey data they had, which was the 12-year-old data, and they had run it through their optimization system and produced a route that would, by their calculations, get us through the field's outer debris band, complete a full perimeter survey arc, and exit on the far side with 94.7% efficiency relative to the theoretical optimum. Seth presented the model to Osai on the morning of approach day. Osai looked at it. He looked at it for what I noted without saying anything was probably going to be logged as non-productive engagement with a static display. He looked at it long enough that I could see him working through something, that thing he did where he held an idea up to the light and turned it slowly before he answered. "We'll use your entry vector for the first transit segment," he said finally. "After that, I'll want to go segment by segment based on current sensor readings." Seth's expression shifted by about the width of a hair. That was the Veth version of surprise. "The model accounts for all surveyed features of the Cassock Field," Seth said. "Your survey data is 12 years old. Debris fields of this type have a low drift coefficient. The configuration is unlikely to have changed significantly." "Unlikely," Osai said, "isn't impossible. The probability of encountering a materially significant deviation from the modeled configuration is, by our estimation, below 7%. 7%, Osai said, is not a small number when you're threading a ship through debris. Seth looked at him with that expression of mild ongoing analysis. "The segment-by-segment approach will reduce survey efficiency by an estimated 11 to 19%. "I know," Osai said. "Log it as a deviation." He said that last part without any particular inflection, which meant I was probably the only person in the room who found it slightly funny. Seth logged it. We entered the Cassock Field at 7:40 shipboard time, using the Veth's entry vector, which was by any reasonable measure a good entry vector. The outer debris band was light, isolated chunks of rock, a few larger silicate masses flagged as navigation hazards but well separated, nothing that required more than routine maneuvering to avoid. Ewan's sensor readings matched the old survey data closely enough that two of the Veth assessors on the bridge visibly settled into a slightly more comfortable posture, which for Veth meant that their tablets dropped about 3 centimeters, and the rate of log entry slowed. We transited the outer band in 4 hours, clean per model. At the end of the outer band, Osai called for a full sensor sweep before proceeding to the intermediate density zone. This was the segment-by-segment approach he described. The sweep took 38 minutes. Vel logged it, 38 minutes of non-forward movement during transit. Deviation logged. The sweep results came back. I was at the ops desk watching the display populate, and I had the particular sensation of seeing something you expected to see, and another thing you did not expect to see in the same picture. The intermediate zone had the density gradients the model predicted in most areas, and in one area, in a roughly oval section of approximately 200,000 square kilometers centered on coordinates that didn't appear in the old survey at all, it had something else. Dense, much denser than the model showed. The kind of density that doesn't appear in a survey dataset if it wasn't there when the survey was conducted. "Commander," I said, "you're going to want to look at the sweep." He was already looking. The section I was flagging was directly athwart our modeled transit path, not clipping it, directly in our path. The Veth's 94.7% efficiency route went straight through a section of the field that had, in the 12 years since their last survey, accumulated a density of large mass debris, objects that their model simply did not contain. There was a silence on the bridge. Assessor Seth moved to the display. He looked at it for considerably longer than 11 minutes. He did not appear to be logging anything. He appeared to be running a calculation that wasn't resolving. This section was not present in our survey data, Veth said, which was accurate and also not useful. No, Osei said, it wasn't. The drift coefficient for this region should not permit this level of mass accumulation in the interval since our survey. Something accumulated anyway, Osei said. Another silence. The transition zone, I said, keeping my voice flat. The gradient at the outer to intermediate boundary, it was interpolated. The intermediate zone's actual mass distribution wasn't directly measured at the boundary. The model assumed the interpolated gradient was representative. I paused. It wasn't. Seth looked at me. That expression of mild analysis was working very hard. Our transit model will require recalculation, Seth said. Osei said, how long? Seth consulted with Veth. There was an exchange in rapid Veth that the translator caught as something like, current model parameters insufficient for uncharted density zone. Recalculation requires density mapping of the anomalous section. Estimated time for mapping protocol plus recalculation cycle is 4 to 6 standard hours. Osei said, we're inside the field. We've got debris movement on the outer band starting to close the entry corridor. 4 to 6 hours puts us in a tighter geometry than I want. Seth said, understood. We will begin the recalculation. Osei looked at the display for another moment. Then he looked at me. I had been at the ops desk long enough to know that when Osei looked at me that way, he was not asking me a question. He was checking that I was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation, which was what he needed his ops coordinator to be. I had the alternate route pulled up before he turned back to the main display. There's a secondary path, I said. Longer. It goes north of the anomalous zone, through a region that looks based on current sensor data, not the old survey like it's lower density than the model shows. Probably because whatever accumulated in the anomalous zone pulled mass from adjacent regions over time. The north sector looks like it was partially depleted in the same process that filled the south sector. Seth said, that path is not in the model. I know, I said. I built it from the sweep data we just took. The sweep resolution isn't sufficient for confident navigation in an uncharted section of intermediate density debris. No, I agreed, it's not. A pause. Seth was running his calculation. I waited. You're proposing to navigate an uncharted section of a debris field using insufficient sensor data, Seth said. I'm proposing to navigate a section of this debris field using the best current data we actually have, I said, as opposed to a model built on data that's 12 years old and demonstrably incomplete. I said it without any edge to it. It wasn't a point I was making. It was just the situation. Osei was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Seth, you're welcome to continue the recalculation. We'll begin moving on Ensign Dahl's route. If your recalculation produces a better path before we commit to the northern approach, I'll hear it. Seth said, the recalculation will take 4 to 6 hours. Then you'd better start now, Osei said. I want to describe what the next 3 hours looked like, because I think it's the part that doesn't compress well into a summary. It did not look dramatic. That's the first thing. There were no alarms, no raised voices, no moments where it felt like a story you'd tell later. It looked like 22 people doing their jobs with the kind of attention that comes from taking the work seriously, and 9 Veth assessors watching them do it and running calculations that weren't quite resolving. Osei put us on the northern approach vector at a speed low enough to give Ewan's sensors meaningful resolution ahead of our position, slower than optimal by about 30%, which Veth logged immediately. He had Dvorak and Prinz on engine and maneuvering, 1 person on thrust, 1 person on vector. The secondary maneuvering array was calibrated to the tolerances that Dvorak and Prinz had been maintaining together for 2 years. Those 40-minute paired calibration sessions that the efficiency log had marked as redundant. The array was tight. It responded cleanly when Prinz made corrections, and Prinz made corrections frequently, because the northern approach was going to require micro-adjustments that you couldn't pre-plan, only react to. Redundant deployment, logged. He had Marchetti on manual debris tracking, eyeballs on the forward visual feed, cross-referencing with Ewan's sensor data, calling out any discrepancy between what the sensors said and what the visuals showed. Sensor sweeps at this resolution have edge cases. Large debris objects with irregular surface texture can present misleading return signatures to automated systems. Marchetti had been reading debris geometry for longer than I'd been alive, and his pattern recognition was something the sensors didn't have and couldn't replicate. Redundant check, logged. He had Nakamura on continuous comms monitoring, not because we expected to receive anything, but because Nakamura had a habit of maintaining an open monitoring posture in complex situations, which meant that if anyone in the fleet had updated data on the Kasich field from a more recent transit, Nakamura would catch it. Nobody did, but having someone listen costs less than missing the message that arrives. Non-essential monitoring, logged. He had me running the ops coordination, which meant I was watching everything: sensors, maneuvering, comms, the Veth recalculation progress in the background, the debris field geometry evolving as we moved into it, and maintaining a running model of where we were versus where we needed to be, updating the route estimate every 7 minutes as new sensor data came in from our forward position. 7 minutes wasn't in any procedure manual. It was the interval at which the incoming sensor data was meaningfully different from the last sweep, given our speed and the field's density. I'd worked that out in my head in the first 10 minutes of the transit. Vel asked me once why 7 minutes. I said because 6 isn't quite enough and 8 is too long. Vel logged that as a non-standard operating interval with undocumented justification. The northern zone was not empty. It was lower density than the anomalous section, meaningfully lower, but it had debris, chunks the size of ground vehicles floating in slow, irregular paths, chunks the size of small buildings, some tumbling, some not. One mass the size of a city block that Marchetti spotted on the visual feed 3 seconds before Ewan's sensors flagged it, which gave Prinz enough time to call the correction and Dvorak enough time to execute it before it became a problem. 3 seconds. Vel logged it. Manual visual identification preceding sensor confirmation by 3 seconds. Non-standard procedure. Deviation logged. What wasn't in the log was the calibration record that made the maneuvering array respond cleanly enough that a 3-second margin was actually a margin. What wasn't in the log was the years Marchetti had spent reading debris geometry, until it was something he could see without calculating. What wasn't in the log was the trust that let Prinz call and Dvorak execute without a beat of hesitation between the call and the response, because they had done that particular handoff enough times that it was reflex. We went through it that way in 7-minute increments for 3 hours. No alarms, no film moment revelations. Just the work, done carefully, with more hands on it than the model required, and more cross-checking than the error rate statistically warranted, and slower forward movement than the efficiency calculation had planned for. At 2 hours and 20 minutes, we cleared the densest section of the northern approach, and the debris thinned noticeably. Ewan confirmed the forward path. I updated the route estimate. Dvorak reduced thrust incrementally as the maneuvering load dropped. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Veth recalculation completed. Seth came to the ops desk and said, "Our revised model is complete." I said, "What does it show?" Seth showed me the display. The revised route went through the northern zone. Their model, now incorporating the sweep data and the forward sensor readings we'd been logging and transmitting to their recalculation system throughout the transit, had converged on the path we were already on. We were, at the moment Seth showed me the display, approximately 2/3 of the way through the section his revised model recommended. I said, "Good to know." I meant it. It was genuinely good to know that their recalculated model and our current data navigation had converged on the same answer. It told me we were probably right. Confirmation from a different direction is worth something, even when it arrives 2 hours after you've committed to a course. Seth looked at the display. He looked at our position on it. He looked at the sensor log entries showing how we'd gotten there, 7-minute intervals, manual crosschecks, paired maneuvering, Marchetti's 3 seconds. He said, "You routed through this section without a model." "We routed through it with current data and judgment," I said. "The model caught up." He was quiet for a moment. The approach was not optimal. I looked at him. "We're through." We exited the Cassock Field's far perimeter at 22:10 shipboard time. The transit had taken 14 hours and 22 minutes, against the model's projected 9 hours and 4 minutes. It had covered 71% of the planned survey arc rather than the modeled 100%, because we'd gone around the anomalous zone rather than through it. By the Veth's efficiency framework, we had achieved approximately 58% of theoretical optimum, which was worse than the 61.3% they'd logged for our general operations. Osai wrote the transit summary himself that night. It was clear and factual, and gave the Veth recalculation team full credit for the updated model, and it noted, without emphasis, that the updated model had agreed with the navigated route. It also noted the anomalous density zone, its probable origin in mass migration from the depleted northern sector, and the implication that the 12-year survey interval had been long enough for a meaningful redistribution. He recommended updating the Cassock Field survey database to reflect the actual current configuration. He didn't recommend anything about how we'd gotten through. That part was in the ops record, for anyone who wanted to look. I was at the ops desk writing the detailed ops record when Seth appeared beside me. He stood there for a moment in silence, which for Veth I had come to understand as a precursor to something that required more careful framing than usual. "The recalculation," he said, "required the sensor data your crew generated during the northern approach." "Yes," I said. "You built the revised model on our readings as we went." "The revised model and your navigation path were in agreement." "They were." Seth was quiet for another moment. "Your crew navigated a section of the debris field for which no model existed." "We navigated it with what we had." The probability of a navigation error in an uncharted section of intermediate density debris, absent a validated model, would by standard assessment be. "Hive," I said, "I know." And yet, I agreed. Another pause. Seth's expression was doing that thing where the calculation was running. "Your crew employed redundant operators, manual visual crosschecks, and 7-minute route update intervals. These are procedures that your standard operational documentation does not require in normal transit." "No," I said. "They're procedures we use when we're operating in conditions we don't fully understand. The normal transit documentation is for when we understand our conditions. The distinction isn't noted in your documentation. It's noted in the crew." Seth looked at me for a moment, 2.1 seconds give or take. "I would like to formally request," he said, "a written summary of the decision-making framework your commanding officer applied during the Cassock transit." I sat with that for a moment. Commander Osai would be better placed to answer that than I am. "I intend to request it from Commander Osai as well. I am requesting your account as the operations coordinator." I thought about it. I thought about the 47 seconds I'd spent looking at a navigational plot on day 3, looking at the 12-year-old survey data, and thinking about the gap. I thought about Marchetti's lunch on day 9, and Pharaoh talking through the approach worry over 22 minutes of a meal until the worry resolved into something precise enough to act on. I thought about the 8-degree entry vector adjustment. I thought about Dvorak and Prinz on the secondary maneuvering array, and the calibration sessions that the log had marked as redundant, and the 3 seconds Marchetti's eyes had given Prinz before the sensors caught up. "I'll write the summary," I said. I want to pause here, because what I wrote in that summary is the part I've thought about most in the years since. I didn't write it as a vindication. I want to be clear about that, because there are people who hear this story and want it to be a vindication, and it isn't quite that. The Veth weren't wrong that we ran at 61% of theoretical optimum. We did. We probably still do. Theoretical optimum is a clean number, and human crews are not clean. What I wrote was this: the Keswick's operating procedures are not calibrated to theoretical optimum. They are calibrated to theoretical optimum plus unknown variance. The distinction is that the first number assumes you know the full shape of the problem you're solving, and the second number assumes you might not. In a well-characterized environment, with current data and stable conditions, the first number is achievable and the second number looks like waste. In an uncharted or partially characterized environment, which is, by definition, every environment you have incomplete data about, the second number is not waste. It is margin. The redundant crosschecks are margin. The non-essential social interaction over meals, the conversations that let Pharaoh talk through the approach worry until it became something precise, is margin. The 14 minutes I spent reading the survey methodology appendix, which nobody had logged as anything other than non-productive engagement with a static archival document, is margin. Marchetti's 3 seconds of visual tracking ahead of the sensors is margin. The 47 seconds of looking at a navigational plot while thinking about the gap between 12-year-old data and reality is margin. The paired calibration sessions that made the secondary maneuvering array clean enough to respond to a 3-second correction notice, margin. None of that looks efficient. None of it is, by the metric of a validated model in a stable environment. In the Kasich field, it looked like us getting out clean. Seth submitted his formal efficiency report on the Kasich 11 days after we exited the field. I didn't see the full report. It was submitted to Fleet Command, not to us, but I shared the summary because that's the kind of he was. The summary noted a general operational efficiency of 61.3%, a significant deviation from optimal process in multiple documented areas, a transit of the Kasich debris field that fell 42% short of survey coverage objectives, and a successful navigation of an uncharted intermediate density section that resulted in 0 loss of vessel, crew, or mission-critical equipment. The report also included a recommendation. The recommendation was that the Veth Assessor Corps adopt a modified efficiency framework for application to vessels operating in partially characterized environments. Specifically, a framework that incorporated what the report called non-deterministic margin protocols, which was the Veth assessor's way of describing everything we'd been doing that they'd been logging as deviation for 3 weeks. Non-deterministic margin protocols. It was a remarkable phrase. It meant the things you do because you know you don't know everything. Marchetti read the summary in the mess hall at a 22-minute lunch, during which he said nothing about it, talked for a while about an unrelated posting, and then went back to work. Pharaoh read it and looked like a person who had been quietly worried that worrying about the approach transition point was somehow wrong. Ewan read it and went back to the morning sensor logs, which hadn't changed overnight and which Ewan was going to look at anyway. I read it and thought about Seth's expression when he'd said, "and yet," that particular calculation, the one that had taken 18 days and a debris field to resolve. On the last morning before the delegation disembarked, Assessor Vell came to the secondary bridge. I was at the ops desk, working through the transit documentation, making sure the sensor logs and the route update records were properly archived before they got handed off to the survey team as navigational reference for future CASIC transits. Those notes were going to matter. The anomalous zone, the northern path, the density readings we'd taken at 7-minute intervals for 3 hours, all of it was going into a record that would make the next ship's transit better. That was the point of documentation. You do the work, you write it down, and the person behind you starts from somewhere better than where you started. Val stood at the edge of the desk for a moment in the Veth way that meant something needed to be said, but was still being assembled into the right shape. The section of your procedures that we classified as non-essential social interaction, Val said. Yes, I said. We had a category error. I looked up, how so? We classified it by its form, conversation during meals, interpersonal exchange not directly preceding a task. We logged the form. Vel paused. We did not log the function. I thought about Faro and Marchetti, and the 8 degrees of entry vector, and what all of it had added up to inside the debris field. No, I said, you didn't. The function was. Vel paused again, and I had the sense of watching someone reach for a word in a second language, a word that existed in one vocabulary but hadn't been coined yet in another. The function was something like distributed modeling. The crew was maintaining a shared model of the mission state through informal exchange, such that concerns and observations moved laterally across the crew outside of formal reporting structures. Faro's concern about the gradient transition reached you and Commander Osai through Marchetti, via a 22-minute conversation that the log recorded as non-essential. The concern then produced a 14-minute appendix review that was also logged as non-productive, which produced the 8-degree vector adjustment, which gave us the sensor angle on the transition boundary that confirmed the anomaly before we were committed to the modeled path. It was a very good reconstruction. It was precise and complete, and had taken Vel 3 weeks of watching us eat lunch and work and talk to arrive at. Yes, I said, that's most of it. And the remainder? I thought about it. The remainder is that people work better when they're not just workers, I said. When there's some room in the day to be a person and not a function, it keeps things from going brittle. You can optimize a crew down to where it runs at theoretical maximum in ideal conditions, and then watch it fail the first time conditions aren't ideal, because there's no slack anywhere for anything to give. Vel looked at me for a moment, running the calculation. You're describing a structural property. I suppose I am, I said. We had it as noise. Vel paused. It was load-bearing. I looked at Vel for a moment. That was a more precise statement of the thing than I had managed in 2 pages of written summary. Yes, I said, that's it exactly. Vel wrote something on the tablet. I didn't ask what. I went back to the transit documentation. The archive needed to be done before the handoff, and there was nobody else who was going to do it, and the next crew deserved a clean record. Seth disembarked at 900, same as he'd arrived. 9 of them through the collar, tablets in hand, already logging something on the way out. He stopped at the collar for a moment and turned back, and for a second I thought he was going to say something that would have felt like a conclusion. The kind of thing that, in a story, someone says at the end to make the meaning land cleanly. He said, your sensor logs from the northern approach have been incorporated into the updated CASIC field survey database. Good, I said. Future transits will benefit from them. That was the point, I said. He nodded, a nod that was not quite the same as the one he'd given when he arrived. Something in it was slightly recalibrated, as if a prior model had been revised. Then he went through the collar. Commander Osai watched the collar seal, and then looked at me the way he sometimes did when he thought I might have something to add. I didn't, particularly. There wasn't anything to add that wasn't already in the archived sensor logs, in the transit summary, in the documentation, in the non-essential social interaction, and the redundant cross-checks, and the 47 seconds of looking at a navigational plot, and the 3 seconds Marchetti's eyes had on the sensors, and the pairs of hands on a calibration job that only needed one. "Back to work," he said. "Back to work," I said. I went back to the ops desk and pulled up the next mission segment. The survey route continued. There was more field ahead, partially characterized, conditions updating as we moved through them. The model would need adjusting. The crew would do the adjusting. That was the job. It had always been the job. Somewhere, I was fairly sure, a Veth assessor was building a new framework to make room for it. The framework would be precise and well documented and internally consistent. It would miss some things. It would be revised again later when it missed them, the same way the 12-year-old CASIC survey had been revised when it turned out the debris had moved. That's how it goes, with models and with knowledge and with most things worth knowing. You map what you can, you hold the map lightly, and you keep your eyes on the field. I thought about the Veth efficiency log sometimes in the months after. 408 deviations, every one of them real. Marchetti's long lunches, real. Ewan's unchanged morning sensor logs, real. Dvorak and Prinz and 40 minutes of paired calibration on a single operator task, real. 47 seconds of looking at a navigational plot with no operational output generated, real. 408 real deviations. And then one anomalous density zone in the intermediate band of a debris field that a 12-year-old survey had modeled and reality had not consulted, and a northern approach through uncharted territory on current sensor data and judgment, and a ship that came out the other side intact. I don't know what the Veth efficiency framework looks like now, years later. I know they requested OSI's summary and my summary, and the full ops record from the transit. I know the sensor logs from the northern approach are in the CASIC field survey database and have been used by at least 3 subsequent vessels, one of which sent a brief thank you through fleet comms to the CASIC. Nakamura read it aloud at lunch, with the friendly contextual preamble that preceded all of Nakamura's communications, and then we went back to work. The Veth assessors had called it non-essential social interaction. Marchetti ate his lunch. We were already doing that. We'd been doing it the whole time.